excited about the next panel of speakers that we have because this is our very own competitive assessment team who last year, those of you that were here, heard. As Dairyland went through its strategic planning processes, one of the things that became very evident is that it was going to become an ongoing process, and we always had to be looking at the competition, what was going on out there, and that frankly that was probably one of the most value-added pieces of the work that we could put into this. So we would come up with general directions, but to refine our course of action, we needed to know just who was doing what out there and what it meant to us. So we formed a competitive advantage team. We took some of our best and our brightest employees at Dairyland, and we asked them to look at some very specific information and data on the industry and formulate a report on our competitors for us. Went wonderfully, and we have kept that team in place, and we are on an ongoing basis looking at that information all the time. Since we have done the alliance with CP, CP has joined our CAT team, so it's become even more exciting because we're working together as a team in this very leading edge area. CP members were part of the assessment that some of the Dairyland folks will be presenting, and I think you'll find it very interesting. I'm also very proud because the three gentlemen that are presenting are three of my right arms, if you can have three right arms. You're going to hear from Jim O'Neill. He's our Director of Marketing at Dairyland. He came to us 2 years ago from Finger Hut. You're going to hear from John Wendling. He's our Director of Strategy. He's been doing a lot of the negotiations for us and interventions and other things, and he came to us internally from Dairyland. And also Neil Kennebeck, who's our Director of Corporate Planning, also an internal transfer from Dairyland, all very new in their jobs, doing a great job in this competitive area. So if you could welcome them with a round of applause, we'll get going.
Thank you very much, Allison. Good afternoon. I couldn't help but thinking when Allison introduced us that, is this working okay? Okay. I couldn't help thinking she must mean it's Jim O'Neill and then the best and the brightest. So we're saving the best and the brightest for the second and third parts of our presentation. We're going to give you a quick report and an overview of the results, some of the results from the competitive assessment process we just completed recently. The competitive assessment team consisted of 9 staff members from Dairyland and represented people from finance, generation, transmission, as well as customer service and planning, as well as 2 staff persons from cooperative power. In your tab, we're going to be talking tab 3 if you want to follow along with us. I apologize. Somehow inadvertently we didn't get the names of the 2 CP staff members, but you can see them up here in that sheet. Basically, I'm going to focus on what's happened recently in the regional market. Neil is going to talk about recent merger activity, and then John is going to give us a quick overview and a cost comparison to see how we compare cost-wise with the competition in our area. That's the kind of the scheme we've got. I'd like to focus on the regional market. And first of all, you can see for a market indicator, for simplicity's sake, we use the entire states of Minnesota, Iowa, and Wisconsin. And at a retail level, electric sales in those 3 states represent about $8.2 billion. Now that is about 4.1% of the total national electric retail sales. And as you can see here, 77% of retail sales in this region are accounted for by the investor-owned utilities, and the munis and the co-ops in aggregate each represent about 11 or 12%, or about $1 billion in retail sales. Another way of looking at the retail market, the same $8.2 billion, you can see that 33% of retail sales are to the industrial customers. And because these are the customers that we know, the very large industrial customers, are going to be demanding lower prices, and they're a prime force moving us towards a much more competitive environment and retail wheeling in the near future. 33% of the market is industrial. That has been growing at an average annual growth rate of about 2.9% for the last 6 years or so. Commercial represents about 24% of the total market, and that's been growing about 2.8% the last 6 years or so, just a little bit slower. You can see the residential market represents about 42% of total retail sales, and that's been growing just a little over 2.1% average annual growth rate during that same period of time. So it's a bigger hunk right now, but in the past 6 years or so, it's been growing a little slower. Now, I'd like to look at each of those markets kind of one at a time, if you will. Now, what we did, because of the announcement of the Primergy merger and the Interstate Energy merger, we kind of put them together to look at. And you can see that the industrial market is $2.7 billion. Primergy represents 45% of the industrial market in our region. Interstate, the other merger that recently has been announced, represents another 15%. So between those two entities, when they come to pass, we're talking about 60% of the industrial sales in our region are accounted for by either Primergy or the Interstate Energy companies. You can see Primergy is 3 times as big as Interstate Energy, and it's 5 times the size in industrial sales of Minnesota Power, for instance. So we're talking about some pretty big competitors, and these are both mergers that have been announced since the last, as you heard this morning, since the last customer symposium that we had last February. Thing to point out up here, it is interesting to note that when you aggregate the munis in total, they represent a significant share, 12.8%, I believe, of the industrial sales in the market. There's a significant, everyone's going to be looking at data like this, and things like that are going to be noticed. And we can be sure that the large investor owners are going to go after all large C&I customers, and certainly the large industrial customers. And the munis are going to be, like co-ops, are going to be facing a very tough fight to hold on to that 12.8% share as we move forward. And I just point out Dairyland and CP co-ops together account for about 1.1% of industrial sales in the region. Just for your convenience, if you happen to be looking through it and looking at the charts later on, we put in here just a listing of the people that we have on the next chart so you can see what the initials stand for. Now, basically, what we did here is we did a mapping of industrial rates and revenue. And let me just explain what we have here. On the, along the horizontal line, we're showing industrial revenue as a percent of total revenue for the entity. And on the vertical line, we're showing the industrial rate in cents per kilowatt hour. This horizontal line up here is the average rate in our region for industrial sales. And that is about 4.1 cents per kilowatt hour. Now, the national average is 4.9 cents per kilowatt hour. So you can see we're starting off with a relatively low price in our region, about 16% below the national average. And we can expect it's probably going to go lower as we know it's going to go lower as we move forward. But that kind of sets up the chart for you. And what we've done is the people for the various utilities, we've indicated by a different symbol the variable cost of generation. So in other words, Minnesota Power is a very low-cost producer. Interstate Power here is a very high-cost producer, just to see the situation. And as you can see here, just to give you an example, Minnesota Power, about 78% of their revenue comes from their industrial customers, and it looks like they're about 3.8 cents, something like that, average rate is what we're looking at. What we can gather from in terms of a competitive assessment from a mapping like this is that those utilities who have very high rates are likely to face stringent market margin erosion as we go forward in a retail wheeling environment. So the cooperative power, Minnesota munis, the Iowa munis, Actually, NSP, surprisingly enough, as we move to a retail wheeling environment, they're likely to have extreme pressure on their margins as they compete for their customers and lower the margins. Because obviously, people with very, very high prices are going to look, relatively high prices, are going to look for cost relief. Also, the companies that have a high percentage of their revenues that come from industrial customers are also vulnerable to margin erosion. That's because they have so many customers. If they start, losing them in a retail wheeling scenario, that pressure will ensue. So I think that's very interesting. I wanted to move on then to the commercial market. This market's about $2 billion in size, and you can see that Primergy and Interstate Energy, I guess it didn't come out very well the way this slide comes out, but they represent 38% in the Primergy case and another 15% for Interstate Energy. So they dominate the commercial market also. I think another thing to notice on this slide is the munis in aggregate in the 3 states still represent a very high percentage of the commercial retail sales. And Dairyland co-ops and cooperative power together, our cooperatives represent about 2.4% of the region average, of the region commercial sales. Did the same type of mapping here, okay? You can see of course the numbers are different, but on the vertical scale we have the average commercial rate, and we have the percent of total revenue generated by commercial customers for each of the utilities. You can see the average rate is about 6.1 cents. That's significantly higher than the industrial rate. And you can see we plotted for instance, let's look at MG&E. They get about 58% of their revenues from commercial customers, and it looks like it's about a 5.7 cent average rate. People with high rates, again, are vulnerable. In this case, the Dairyland cooperatives. That's Interstate Power there. It's a little hard to see. Cooperative Power. NSP, again, has above average rates for our region. And you can see even Interstate Energy is up there. So those are areas of potential vulnerability in terms of, we would expect the large industrial customers to first get the price breaks and the lower prices. Then those large commercial customers are the ones that can be aggregated, are the next area where we'd expect the pressure to emerge, and then after that it'll broaden throughout the market. Residential market is the next one I'd like to touch on. As you recall, it represents the biggest of those 3 market segments that we're talking about. You can see Primergy at 34%, Interstate Energy at 13%. They still are very, very big players in the market, but as you can see, as we walk from industrial to commercial to residential, the dominance has slid down a little bit from piece to piece. Want to point out that the cooperatives that represent that comprise the Dairyland and the cooperative power systems represent about 10% of the residential market, and that's very, very significant share, and perhaps it's a strength that we can build on as we move forward. And just the same type of comparison for the residential rates and revenues, just to give you an overall mapping and a sense of what the competitive position is at this point in time. Again, the percent of total revenue coming from residential customers is along the horizontal line. Along the vertical, we have the average residential rate. You can see the average rate there is about 7.3, 7.4 cents. And again, those utilities who are well above the average stand to see some significant margin erosion as the freewheeling environment eventually gets to the residential level. It's interesting to note that Dairyland, where a very high proportion of our co-ops revenues come from residential sales, and we're slightly above the average at this point in time, is what you note there. Another thing I'd like to point out, one of the mergers that Niels is going to talk about is the Interstate Energy merger, and two of the components of that are interstate power and IES. Let me see if I can find interstate power. It should be right in here someplace. And IES is over here. There's interstate power right there, excuse me. IES is right here. To the extent, as part of the merger, that in Iowa, that if they kind of blend their Iowa rates in that state, to the extent that interstate power's rates move up towards IES's rates, our co-ops that are competing against interstate power will become, through that movement upward in their rates, if it does occur, will become slightly more competitive. So there's a little bit of good news in that situation. Basically, just to give you a summary of what we've talked about, is our low C&I share may provide some initial stability as we see these rapid changes engulfing our industry. There's no doubt that they're coming, but our basic position of having a low C&I share may give us a little extra time, not saying that we should, we don't need to change and we don't need to act quickly, but we do have an opportunity here to build and strengthen our alliances, and as we move forward. We have a little more time to prepare for the competitive environment than we might otherwise. We're all going to be looking for C&I load, because industrial load that improves our time of day load shape helps improve the plant operating efficiencies and helps generate lower overall costs of electricity. So we'll all be looking for those loads. They're important, but we're starting in some senses with a little strategic advantage because they're not important to us right now. So we have an opportunity to improve as this competitive world emerges. And the strong presence that our member systems have in the residential area do give us perhaps a strategic opportunity, and certainly a strength that we can leverage off as we move forward in this competitive environment. We can strengthen the relationships that we have with our customers. We can get our costs down. We can get our service up, and we can cement a relationship on that strong residential base that can bode us well as we try to compete in the future. Now, that pretty much summarizes what I wanted to say about the overall market. So I'm going to ask Neil if he'd come up now and talk to us about the mergers that have recently occurred in the industry. So, Neil, do you want?
Thanks, Jim. Good afternoon. Perhaps some of the most competitive activities that we've seen going on in the nation in the last 12 months are mergers. The map shown there indicates 8 mergers that have occurred in the last 12 months in the United States. These mergers have typically been between IOU electric utilities, electric and gas utilities. They're forming energy companies of much larger sizes. They're typically managed by very skillful, entrepreneurial, and aggressive individuals. They are looking to cut costs, and cut costs. And when they've got their costs cut, then they're going to market their product. The merger activity looks to things like labor reductions, elimination of redundant functions and processes. They look to achieve greater efficiencies in economic dispatch of a larger and more varied generation mix, to reduce transmission costs associated with wheeling, pancaking costs involved with wheeling. And they're doing just that. If you look at that map, though, the most striking part of it, at least to me, is the fact that 5 of those 8 are in the Midwest. And 2 of those 5 are smack dab in our backyard. And, why are they happening in the Midwest? Well, I'm not really sure, other than the fact that Those Midwestern utilities that are merging have been led by some very aggressive individuals. I'm basically going to focus on three mergers today, and that will be, the first one will be the most recent merger, which was announced only a week or so ago between Utilicorp and Kansas City Power and Light, and then the Interstate Energy merger, which is comprised of Wisconsin Power and Light and Interstate Power and IES. And then finally, I'll talk briefly about Primergy, which is certainly the big kid on the block. Utilicorp and Kansas City Power and Light, they haven't got a name yet. It's such a recent merger. But here you can see they're bringing together some fairly substantial assets between the two of them, with approximately 4.9 million, or 4,900 megawatts of generating capacity and fairly substantial other assets. They're also bringing together a total of 1.6 million customers that are fairly well divided between electrical services and gas services. Although they don't appear to be in our backyard, it should be noted that Utilicorp has opened a gas services office in Rochester, Minnesota. They are also in our backyard. Their electrical generation is approximately 19% of the regional total when these two companies merge. Interstate Energy, which announced their merger, it was during deer season. It was about the first week of November, as I recall. They produce a fairly large service area, and what's alarming about that, if you could lay hours right in it, it's very large service area, and it has a very extensive transmission system associated with it. In terms of some of the financial considerations, it's a $4 billion company in assets with nearly $2 billion in total revenues. They announced savings of $700 million over a 10-year period. However, we feel that those savings, their total savings will be well in excess of $700 million. The savings they've announced were primarily due to procurement efficiencies and labor reductions, and in all likelihood they do not include the savings they'll derive from economic dispatch and outage coverages of their own plants. In terms of customers, here again, they've got a fairly well balanced balance between electric service and gas. And they comprise a total of 1.22 million customers. These mergers, you know, they attempt to find ways to optimize diversity between different companies. And in this case, major contributions that have been brought to bear in the case of Interstate Power, which frankly the pundits were wondering who was going to take them over and when, were languishing under a rather onerous coal contract. Their prices were fairly high, but they do bring some real value to this merger in that they have excess capacity that WP&L and IES did not have, so they actually defer the need for this new company's capacity. And this onerous coal contract will go away in 1998, and that will provide substantially cheaper energy than they now have. And their Lansing plant, which they've been running at about 25% capacity factor, will most likely will have another 1 million megawatt hours available at very competitive rates. As Jim had indicated too, Interstate brings a very substantial industrial base to this group. IES, on the other hand, they bring cheap energy now. They also bring fairly high fixed costs. And that's one of the reasons that the blended rate between these two is actually a little higher than what Interstate Power currently has. Access to more markets. You saw the size of that service area and the transmission system, and IES has a lot of potential in that respect. And IES also has a fairly large industrial base, about 30%. But they're also fairly high priced, as Jim had noted. WP&L, well, they also bring a fairly good generation mix, coal, nuclear. They have a fairly good transmission system, fairly high population density areas. And but what we saw is perhaps what they bring to the table more so than the others is a strategic vision, entrepreneurial skillfulness and management skills, and a near mad dog aggressiveness in marketing through Mr. Davis. So the company, Interstate, will be led basically by key individuals from WP&L, and that is a very important feature. In terms of their transmission, as I noted, they have a large transmission network. It basically spans the gap between South Dakota and Illinois, touching Minnesota, Wisconsin, Iowa, in between. They're interconnected to 12 other utilities as well. That large transmission system will allow them to eliminate pancaking. In other words, they'll have one rate across that entire transmission system and make them more competitive from that perspective. And even though Wisconsin Power and Light is not directly interconnected, physically interconnected with those Iowa utilities, they can, frankly, perfect that transmission link through a contractual arrangement. And that arrangement could be made with either NSP, Commonwealth Edison, or Dairyland Power. And as I understand, some of those discussions are underway. Dairyland, in the past, had somewhat of a unique role with Wisconsin Power and Light in that we provided access for them to some of the cheap energy that came out of Manitoba Hydro and Western Lignite. And because we're interconnected, we were the gatekeeper between them and MAP. And now that they have announced this merger, they're anticipating becoming a member of MAP, and that may diminish to some extent some of the revenues we enjoyed in being the gatekeeper in the past. In terms of generation, they're approximately 5,300 megawatts, about 20% of the capacity in the region. They've got fairly competitive prices. These are production costs here of about $17.65. That's simply an average of their total power plant mix. They've got diversified generation, which is also important. They're 75% coal, 12% gas, and 11% nuclear, which sort of a risk management hedge against any one particular fuel taking off in costs. The retail market implications, Jim really touched on those fairly well, but Interstate is vulnerable to retail wheeling because 68% of their market is industrial. IES is vulnerable to some margin erosion because their C&I rates are so high. I think they're like 6.8 cents. It definitely strengthens the position of each of those individual companies when they all get together. And as Jim had pointed out, the blended merger rate is expected to make our Iowa co-ops more competitive with with Interstate Power. But that's yet to be seen. That those blended rates will be based on the cost cuts that they can achieve. And then, of course, the the big kid, the big bully on the block, appears to be Primergy. Here you can see the service areas that they cover. NSP and Wisconsin Electric Power combined into Primergy are 11.2 billion in assets, 4 billion in total revenue, and here 2 billion in savings, which they announced. Again, we don't believe that includes economic dispatch of their facilities. We really believe they'll have more savings than that. In terms of customers, again, a good mix of electric and gas. The Primergy brings to bear a total of 3.1 million customers and will have dominance over 30% of the gas sales in Minnesota and Wisconsin. Major contributions. NSP is a large company. It's very well interconnected from the transmission standpoint. They have access to low-cost power, both in North Dakota Lignite and Manitoba Hydro. WEPCO, very aggressive management under Mr. Abdu. Access to attractive markets. I think what that probably means is the 12.5-cent energy in Chicago that Mr. Abdu has sort of had his sights on Chicago as a potential market for some time, and we think that that may be part of what this entire merger is going to attempt to achieve. WEPCO also brings, of course, high population densities. And in terms of transmission, Dairyland and CP are heavily interconnected. I believe Dairyland has an interchange of energy of about 100 megawatts with the NSP system. Basically, NSP is a transmission hub of MAP. They are interconnected to 13 utilities. They enjoy interconnections with Kansas City and St. Louis areas, and the now obviously the eastern portion of Wisconsin and right down to the doorstep of Chicago. There may be some opportunities in that. NSP Wisconsin will be closing, as we understand it, their offices in Eau Claire. Those will be moved to Milwaukee. That may leave a gap, may leave some services opportunities in this, or some other types of niches in western Wisconsin. From a generation standpoint, they're big, big, big. They basically have 2/3 of the generation, of the energy, if you will, and the capacity in Minnesota and Wisconsin. That translates to about 54% of the entire region that we've looked at. They have approximately just a little under 13,000 megawatts right now, but they're expected to require an additional 800 to 1,100 megawatts by the year 2000. It's not clear at this time how they intend to get that, if they're going to purchase it from IPPs or NUGs, if they're going to build. We don't really know, but we know it's a fairly substantial chunk of capacity. NSP is also faced with a bit of a problem in Prairie Island with it's a spent fuel issue. Their storage capacity is nearly exhausted, and unless they can get some alternative storage facilities underway, they may have to close their Unit 1, which is a 550 megawatt nuclear plant. Retail market implications, well, as Jim had indicated, they're 45% of the industrial, 38% of the commercial, and 34% of the residential. And their C&I rates are slightly above the regional average, but that's based on 1994 data. Sort of a summary here. What we are seeing is, in the last 12 months in our regions, basically 8 utilities have collapsed down to 3 large ones in the last 12 months. They're expected to be very astute and aggressive in their marketing. very tough competitors. They will cut costs, they will cut staff, they will do economic dispatch, they will do outage coverage, and they will have reduced transmission costs. They're energy companies. They're going to they're going to go after the market with gas and electricity. They're going to play them off one another in any way they can optimize their profits. They're going to have greater market access. They're going to have greater risk mitigation because of their spreading their activities over larger asset bases, over larger customer bases, over larger geographical areas. And they're going to, these three combined represent 6 million customers and approximately 85% of the regional generation. They will ultimately end up on this basis with 67% of the industrial loads, 66% of the commercial, and 59% of the residential loads, just these three in our region. And they're definitely a force to be reckoned with, and they will be turning up the competitive pressures as soon as they're allowed to. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to John Wendling, who's going to speak to you about costs.
As the ex-budget person, they left me with the truly exciting part of the presentation, cost analysis, and I'm going to try and make it as informative as I can and not get too bogged down in number review. Basically, the CAT team wanted to provide a strategic look at the unbundled view of the industry as we perceive it's going to be in the upcoming future. We did that by taking the costs that are reported by all utilities, whether it be to FERC or REA, and we broke them down into four basic functional areas. I think in some of the earlier presentations, you heard these referred to as business units, but basically they're power supply, which includes generation, transmission, distribution, and then a fourth category that we've called customer and energy services. Today, during our presentation, we're going to concentrate on the wholesale aspects of these comparisons. So we're going to look primarily at power supply, which includes generation, and transmission. Basically, what we did was we took all the operating costs for 1994, we took historical costs, and we broke them into those functional areas. Typically, costs are, you can think of them in three types of categories. Direct costs, those are costs that are incurred right by the functional area. That would include such things as direct labor and materials and that kind of thing. Fixed costs, those are costs of investment, typically depreciation, interest on the loans, property taxes, insurance, those kinds of costs. And then the indirect costs that are not directly related to the functional area, but nonetheless are incurred by the utility in general. And the biggest example of this would be the administrative in general, the corporate office costs. Just to quickly review the regional panel, the competitive panel that we selected, these are the top 10 largest utilities in our service territory. In addition, what we did was we combined, we made the 94 numbers look like Primergy had already happened, Interstate Energy had already happened, and the alliance of Darrellin and Cooperative Power had already happened back in 1994. What I'm going to do is highlight the series of cost analysis using a series of graphs. The first graph is, again, 1994 data. It's the generation O&M costs. Basically, This is all generation, operation, and maintenance costs for all types of generation, whether it be nuclear, hydro, gas, any coal. The lower part of the yellow part of the graph represents the variable part of generation cost. In other words, it varies with output, and it's predominantly made up of fuel cost. And the blue part of the line or of the graph represents the fixed component, which is primarily plant labor. The orientation of the graph is the Alliance, the Dairyland and Cooperative Power Alliance. The 94 historical numbers have been combined to show one number. And then the second bar is the average, and that's the average of everybody to the right. And then we've ranked the competitors from low to high, so the highest being on the right side. When you look at that graph, it tells us probably a pretty good story. It says that the Alliance generation O&M cost of about pretty close to $16 is about 8% below the Pano average of a little over $17 a megawatt hour. This is stated in terms of dollars per megawatt hour generated. It could also be stated in terms of mils per kilowatt hour. The numbers would be equivalent. Our conclusion, our team's conclusion from looking at generation, remember now this is 94 data, is that the Alliance generation, operation, and maintenance costs are in the competitive range with the other regional competitors looking at 1994. The next graph builds on this graph, on the previous one, and it adds the other component to cost, and that is the truly fixed cost, the depreciation, the interest, and the administrative and general allocated costs, the costs that probably don't vary with output. And that's represented by the red line or the red bar. Again, the Alliance total generation costs of about $28 a megawatt hour, you can see is below the average, about 9% below the average, which is pretty close to $31. On the low end of the scale, we see Mid-America and Wisconsin Public Service, and on the high end of the scale, we see IES down in Iowa and NSPW, NSP of Wisconsin at the very, very outside. It was the team's observation that, of course, the team observed that the Alliance high capacity factor, which means that's a capacity factor is the number of hours that our generators run versus not run, in simplistic terms, is higher than the regional competitive, the average. We, as an Alliance, ran at about 59% in 1994, and all of the competitors averaged about 50%. And what this means is that when you equate fixed costs to a per unit cost, since our units are running more, we have more megawatt hours to divide the same dollar pools, so our cost on an average basis is lower. The next graph is total power supply, and this says while predominantly power supply is generation, in the Alliance's case it's about 80% of the power supply, there's also this other purchase power that gets integrated into the total power supply. And the picture here is pretty similar to the generation one, and that is that the Alliance total power supply of a little over $26 a megawatt hour is about 14% below the Pano average of a little over $30.40. And you can see that Minnesota Power and Wisconsin Public Service are on the low end of the scale, and again IES in Iowa, NSP Wisconsin, and MG&E are on the upper end of that scale. Here's some key takeaways in the power supply area. we conclude that as of now, or 94, that the Alliance power supply is certainly in the competitive range, as we saw it as evidenced on the graphs. We also believe that eventually generation or power supply is going to have to compete on a low-cost basis. So it's critical that the Alliance not become complacent and continue to strive to be the lowest cost provider in this area. Looking to the future, we just heard Neil talk about the mergers, and they're all predicting significant savings. Some of those savings are going to be in labor, but certainly a lot of those savings are going to be in economic dispatch of their power supply system. We kind of think that they're sandbagging us, not telling us all that they have to, just saying what they're required to get their merger approved. And we expect that they're going to be very, very competitive in the power supply area. We also understand that some of our competitors are doing ongoing power plant efficiency initiatives, and that certainly uncompetitive units are going to be closed in the future. It's going to be a fact of life. In addition, competitors are going to seek to raise their capacity factor. Remember what I said, that ours was like 59% in 1994 and the average was 50? Competitors are going to be willing to accept lower prices and run their units to run them more, to get their units to run higher on the efficiency curve. And that's going to ultimately mean lower unit costs. The other area of cost focus that we'll look at today is transmission cost. And transmission cost, the yellow component of the line, or of the bars, represents labor and maintenance devoted to transmission maintenance and operation activities. The blue part of the line represents the investment costs, depreciation, interest, taxes, and some portion of the administrative and general costs. And in this situation, the Dairyland and Cooperative Power Systems, transmission systems, have a cost of about $5.03 or 30 cents per megawatt hour, which you can see the next bar there being the average, about 90% higher than what the average is of our competitors. Of our total, of the Alliance's total, about 80% of that number is fixed cost, things that perhaps we'd have trouble doing it much about: interest, depreciation, and taxes of our network system. About 9% of it's labor, transmission labor, and about 10% of it is transmission material and supply. In thinking about our transmission system, I think we can explain most of that deviation from the very nature of our transmission network. We cover a great distance. We're pretty expansive. We have somewhat lower density, not having the metro areas where transmission utilization is relatively higher. And an electrical engineering term, our power factor is probably a little lower than the rest of the competitors. And you can see that the low transmission cost provider is WEPCO, or Wisconsin Electric, WPS, and Minnesota Power, with the higher cost providers being Interstate Power, Madison Gas and Electric, and NSPW. Madison Gas and NSPW probably being a couple of utilities that are very dependent on buying transmission from other people. So our takeaways on transmission is that the Alliance transmission costs are above the average, but in looking at that, in looking at the components of the cost, there certainly is a lot of those costs that are fixed costs, that are investment-related costs. We need to seek out additional, in order to perhaps lower those costs, we need to seek out and pursue additional cost reduction opportunities and initiatives. We need to find ways to increase the value of our network. One of the ways that we can do that is to align ourselves with a network, with a transmission network that's a low-cost provider and essentially average down. We can also look for ways, cost-effective ways, of improving the transmission network's efficiency. In other words, lowering the losses, the system losses that you incur on the transmission, but that's kind of got to be taken with a grain of salt, because typically those gains have already been wrung out of the system and requires some pretty substantial investments. So you're going to have to kind of target those areas to look at. In summary, the competitive outlook. We'd like to leave you with 3 key thoughts. First, all facets of the marketplace are changing. I don't think anybody knows what the exact nature or the end state of this market's going to look like. All that we do know is that the change is happening now. The market's going to be more varied. It's going to be more complex. It's certainly going to be more sophisticated. We do know that the wholesale side of the market has seen a tremendous growth in the last 5 years, and it hasn't been that the load has grown so tremendously. It's been that the same electrons have been sold and resold over and over again, everybody taking a little bit of a little margin. We also know that the wholesale market is dominated by increased competition and excess capacity, which translates into lower energy and lower capacity prices. And we also know that our customers are changing. They're becoming more sophisticated. We heard this morning about the Asian hotels and the national chains going out for RFPs on all of their power supply needs, even though they're not in one contiguous service territory. From the retail marketplace, we know that the combination of Darrellin and Cooperative Power's members' customer base is largely residential, and that's an advantage that, like Jim pointed out, it might allow us a little more time in adjusting to the change of the marketplace, and it might provide us with that initial stability when retail wheeling becomes a reality. The second key thought, merger pace is accelerating, and there's probably no end in the near future. Many analysts agree that deregulation probably leaves utilities with 2 choices: grow by strategic combination, or shrink by spinning off business units. I'd like to read a quote from Errol Davis. Errol Davis is the CEO of Wisconsin Power and Light, and of course he's the CEO of the Interstate Energy Company, and he said this at a press conference when they were announcing the merger. He said, "The merger gives us scale to remain in the game. It provides us an expanded customer base that will allow the development, testing, and marketing of new services that would be impossible individually." So that's one of the themes that these mergers are playing, is that the merger partners are looking to gain critical mass. They're looking to gain larger revenue streams, larger cash flows, kind of the staying power to weather the storm, weather this market changeability, and it gives them then the resources that they need to develop new products to target new customers. The other takeaway, I guess, from the merger pace is that these mergers that Neil talked about are characterized as mergers of equal. and they will be looking to drive costs downward through economy of scale, through consolidation of work efforts. Some analysts say that there's no way that Primergy and Interstate can realize the kind of savings that they're projecting from their mergers. Our team thinks that there's that much there plus more, that they're really kind of sandbagging on some of the things, and that it's going to be very competitive in the future. On a regional basis, one aspect, when you look at that map, and you saw the one map, I think it was in Allison's presentation, of seeing like 8 or 9 different companies, and all of a sudden in 1 year you're down to 3. On a regional basis, what does that mean? Well, it means that probably there's a potential for less sales for the alliance to make to some of those individual players, because all of a sudden there's fewer customers. They're internalizing some of those sales that would have been opportunity sales to someone else, and that maybe more importantly, there's certainly going to be less margin available or less contribution to fixed costs available as those companies become bigger and can tap other sources. And the last takeaway is that the utility industry is going to continue to focus on cost reduction. In the foreseeable future, the industry is going to be seeking increased economy of scale, lower costs. You've heard this theme over and over again, but it's really going to happen. Remember that when we made this cost presentation or analysis, we were looking at 94 costs. That's 13 months ago. 95 has happened. 96 is upon us. So our numbers haven't been updated for what's really been happening. While the alliance, the Darrell-Lynn Cooperative Power Alliance, is competitive in the power supply area now, we can't let up on the pursuit. We have to pursue additional power plant transmission efficiency, cost reduction initiatives, and we must continue this sense of urgency that you can't stop looking for more reductions, because the industry is changing so rapidly, even more rapidly than we thought even a year ago. In closing, I think I'd like to leave you with a quotation that kind of circulated around our team, and this is from Andy Grove. He's the CEO of Intel. Intel is the manufacturer of the little computer chips that's probably in 50 million personal computers in this country. And you know that the computer industry has just been changing in the last dozen years. We've seen companies overnight go from an idea to a mega billion-dollar company, and we've seen huge corporations essentially demise overnight. And his quote was, "We must reinvent ourselves and become the very company that could put us out of business before somebody else does it." That concludes my presentation, and I'd ask my other members to come up here if there's any questions on the presentation. Turn the lights up, it's pretty hard to see. Yes.
Well, I've got a question for you. Stan Anderson, Dunn County. I've just listened to your presentation. I don't have a big argument about the alliance, but if 100 companies exist and 50, the mergers down to 50 would be much more efficient. Then when that's done, then let's move it down to 25 because they're much more efficient. Let's move it down to 10 and then let's end up with one company. That's the sort of mentality I'm being fed. And I really think there's a better solution. And I'd like to come down here 5 years from now or 4 years from now, I guess that's all the time I've got left, and I'd like to have you take a look at one of these mergers you're talking about and all the savings that you're going to incur and show us if it's become a reality. We constantly have changes in our moral code in this country. We pass them, and then 10 years from now, we start scratching our head and we say, what in the hell happened? We never look back at our mistakes because nobody wants to admit we ever made one. I don't know how you can respond to that, but that's kind of how I feel about the whole thing.
I think you hit on a good point. I think we all feel somewhat trapped in the middle. And probably over our lifetimes, we've seen the business cycle of various aspects of business go from small entrepreneurial shops, small companies, and then in the drive to respond to the marketplace, there's a consolidation and a merger, whether it be the car companies or computer manufacturers or whatever, and there's a consolidation, and then pretty soon you're left with some big companies that can't respond to customers' needs, and then they break up again. AT&T breaks up, and it's hard to know, though, where we are in that business cycle. I think the safe thing to assume is that we're still in the process of kind of getting big, and your point about remaining small and being able to react to the customer's needs, I mean, that's what we've got going for us. That's our advantage, something that they don't have. They're closing customer service offices. You dial Primergy's customer service, it's 1-900 Minneapolis. And here I am in La Crosse, or I'm in southern Minnesota. So they don't have all the answers. And I don't know if we have all the answers either, but in a competitive marketplace, you have to keep your eyes open to what the competition is doing. Maybe not follow them, but as you say, learn from their mistakes and be smarter than they are. Recognize that the real value of our system is the unity and strength and the attachment we have to our customer base. Good question or good comment. Anybody else want to respond? I think you answered. Okay, one more question, I guess, if there's any other. Okay.